I may regret sitting on the floor for this video. I'm trying a different style of video today because, as I've mentioned in some of my previous videos, I applied for a course to learn data skills and I was accepted onto it, which is great, but it obviously means my week is a bit more full on. And so I'm having to think about the kind of content I create and what's going to be easiest for me to manage, etc. So I wanted to try something new, and this is a style of video that I've enjoyed watching other content creators do, and so I thought I'd give it a go for myself. I've actually just opened up this space so that Oren can use the full length of this room now, because before I had this footstool basically shoved between that orange chair and the sofa here, so he was kind of contained to the play area here where all his toys are. So I knew he was safe here, everything was childproofed, but obviously he's getting more active, he can now climb, he can climb up on the sofa, he can get onto that shelf, so I've had to move a few things around. He can even lean over and reach this white shelf here, so as you can see I've had to push the snacks far back out of reach too, but he's getting way more active, and so I realised he can now climb over this no problem. So I finally got a stairgate between the hallway and the living room. The kitchen's already got a stairgate across it, and that means he can use the full space here, which is really lovely. He's got more room to move about in, but it is quite funny because there's not a lot on that other half of the room. The cupboards are already child locked, they have been, because obviously I've had other kids here before, and so this part of the room has always been the most interesting. I knew, because it has all the toys and stuff in, but obviously he wanted to get out and explore a bit more, so I've given him more space, but now he's like, oh, there isn't actually anything that interesting up there. I might as well just come and stay down here. So that's kind of funny. There is actually a door between this room and the hallway, but because I've hung an extra rack over it to give me some more kitchen storage space, which is invaluable to me, it now doesn't actually close properly, so I can push it too, and that's what I do in the evening so that any noise I'm making here doesn't wake Oren up, but it doesn't completely close. So Oren, I mean, he can easily pull the door open and crawl out, so I did need to get a stairgate, and since I've done that, it has made my life a lot easier, so that was definitely worth doing. The topic I want to talk about today is motherhood and identity. I actually did a post on my Instagram stories where I asked you guys to give me any suggestions of things you wanted me to talk about in this style of video, these sort of more long form conversational styles videos, and this was one of the requests that I got, and I actually saw it and I thought, do you know what, I think that's a really interesting topic to delve into, because it's something that's so different to different people and is so based on you as an individual, I think. Now, I personally haven't had too much difficulty making the switch from sort of single me into motherhood me, and I think there's probably a few reasons for that. One being that I have always loved being around children and looking after children. From as young as I can remember, I've always loved it. So I used to spend quite a lot of time with my younger cousins and family and friends. When I got a bit older, I did some babysitting. When I got older still, I did a bit of nannying, and then of course I was a foster care briefly too. So children have, in one way or another, always been involved in my life to some extent, and I also always knew that I wanted to be a mum. So there was no decision making for me about, do I want to have children, don't I, what are the pros and cons to doing that. I never had to have that conversation with myself because I always knew I wanted to have kids. It was a no-brainer for me. Now obviously, even if you do want children, that doesn't mean that you won't have any difficulties with kind of a sense of your identity changing when you move from not having kids to having kids. But I do think, particularly the fostering, actually, that was kind of like a stepping stone for me between me without kids and me having kids. And also there was some aspects of fostering that were very different from having a biological child, but the day-to-day stuff, the kind of cooking and cleaning and housework, just the general kind of monotonous tasks that you have to do, that was the same. And so I was kind of already used to that, and I had a very good taste of at least early parenthood through fostering before I had my son. So I do think that helped me with making that adjustment. Another thing that I think has helped is the fact that I've had my children young, and I'm really interested to hear if other people who have had kids young or who haven't had kids young can either relate to this or kind of can see how this might make sense in their own situations. But for me, I feel like the fact that I got pregnant when I made the decision to have a baby when I was 24, and I got pregnant at 24 too. And even though I had been, working for quite some time before that, I started my business at 15. Admittedly, it started out very small and then it built up over the years, and there was, quite a lot I was doing, certainly in the later years as well with that. And I was working with creating content around menstrual health and giving talks and stuff. And I really enjoyed that work and that life that I had there. So even though I'd worked quite a bit before and I'd had, independence since I was about 18, compared to somebody who maybe waits until their mid-30s to start having a family, I hadn't had as much time to sort of form an identity of myself as just myself and kind of build, maybe, you know, build a big career, build a big network of friends who are at the same place as me, and kind of go through a decade or 2 decades of my life like that, and then decide to have children, which can completely change things for many people. I mean, it can result in you deciding that the career you're in is no longer the one you want to stay in, so that might, you know, you might change that, which is sort of what I've done. You might decide, well, you might realise that actually the friends that you've had all your life, they now don't understand your parenting life, because I do think before you have children, you don't understand what it's like. And a lot of people think that when they have kids, they're like, oh, I don't need to make mum friends because I've got loads of friends. But in reality, like, it's really difficult to see your friends as much as before, because they might say, oh, do you want to like come out this evening? And even if you're not a solo parent, even if you do have a partner, like, there's a number of things that can make that kind of difficult, and it's not always an option for you. And they don't necessarily understand that actually you need to suggest ways to meet with your friends with their babies. You can't just have your friend minus their child once they've had kids. And people who are child free or haven't had children yet, some, I'm not saying that all are like this, some are fantastic at supporting their friends who have kids, but some just don't understand how much work it is having children. And so that can fundamentally change relationships. And so when you have a baby, you go through this big shift where you go on maternity leave for, you know, up to a year in the UK. So you're not working, so that side of your identity is put on pause for a bit. You've got a new human to look after, which, if for many people now, they don't have a lot of experience with babies before they have their own. Some people have never held a baby before, whereas you go back a few generations, it was really common for you to kind of help around the house, help out your parents with the younger siblings, help out a cousin. We were much more interconnected, I think, if you go back a few decades, than we are now. And so it's not uncommon to get to a point where you have kids, but you've not spent much time around them yourself before you have your own. And so that's a huge shock to the system. You've got to learn how to look after this human being. Your body's changed, your hormones are going mad. You've got friends that want to come around and see them, and you know, you want to still see them and they want to help, but they've not had kids maybe, and they don't know how to help. Or maybe they have had children, but they're so busy with their own children that they can't really offer a lot of support to you other than sort of moral support and friendship support. So a lot of your life changes then, and you know, it can be quite a shock to the system, I think. But this is where I think potentially having been younger and not having formed so much of an identity as just myself potentially made that transition into motherhood a little bit easier, because it was like, well, I had some time where it was just me and I was very happy with it just being me. And, you know, I have friends who are still child-free or childless, or who just haven't decided to have kids yet, or maybe won't have kids, I don't know, still early days. And I still had that side of my identity and I still see them. But equally, I've made new friends who do have babies and who are now parents. And so I'm able to kind of straddle these two different sides of my identity and bridge them together quite well. And also, I am going through some changes with regards to my career, because I decided, even before I had my son, that I was going to want to pivot into a new direction. I wasn't quite sure that I was, and I'm currently kind of experimenting and seeing where I might want to go with that. But, you know, that's the main change that's happened for me. And again, I've only had like a 10-year career before this, and so actually pivoting at this point doesn't feel too big. Whereas if I had spent like 20 years potentially, or no, 15, 20 years building up a career and then decided to pivot, that might feel a little bit more challenging, or it might feel a bit more like I'd lost a piece of myself. I do still have that sense. I mean, 10 years is not insignificant. I do still have that sense of there's a bit of me that's changing, and I'm trying to adapt to that. And, you know, I made that video talking about how I was feeling a bit lost at the moment, and that was to do with kind of feeling adrift, not knowing what I want to do career-wise. But in terms of my identity and as myself and as being a mother, that hasn't been a big shift for me. I haven't struggled with the shift from single person to mother. I think another thing that can really affect our experiences of motherhood, particularly new motherhood, is how easy or difficult we find it, and the fact that we tend to judge ourselves for that. If you find it difficult, then you must not be good as a mother because you're finding it difficult, and that is just not the case. I actually had pretty much this exact conversation with a friend of mine recently, who was talking about the fact that an older family member of hers was making comments about how they couldn't understand why she was finding it so difficult because they found it easy in their day, etc., etc. And it's very difficult, I think, navigating relationships with older people, especially family members, because you obviously want to have time with them, but also you need to prioritize your own mental health. And if something's, you know, causing you distress, then it's okay to say, actually, this isn't good for me. And as much as I'd like to see this person, I need to prioritize how I feel too. This isn't something that I personally have had to deal with because I actually don't have any living grandparents anymore. So the oldest generation in my family is my parents at the moment, and my aunts and uncles, obviously. But they've all been really good, and there's kind of an understanding within that generation that actually, like, you don't comment on that stuff. So for me, that's been a lot easier. But I do know that, as I said, for this friend, and I think for some of my other friends too, and I'm sure for some of you out there, navigating a relationship with an elder relative who maybe doesn't understand that something's not appropriate to say can be a little bit more challenging, and knowing how to address that and how to raise it with them and say, actually, like, I need you to stop making this comment because you might think it's harmless, but this is doing a lot of damage to me mentally. But anyway, I was talking to my friend about this, and I said to her, I don't think whether we find parenting easier or harder has any relevance to how good we are as parents. In the same way that you might find it really easy to get pregnant and some people find it really difficult to get pregnant, I wouldn't say to somebody who struggled to get pregnant, oh, like, I don't understand why you're finding it so difficult because I got pregnant quite easily. Because A, I'm not an asshole, and B, that's just completely inappropriate. So whether or not you find something easy or hard does not necessarily mean you're going to be better or worse. The two do not necessarily correlate with each other. For me, I definitely do feel there has been a shift since I became a parent, and there is now this new piece and this new aspect to my identity. The best way I can kind of describe this is almost like having this sense that there was an extra piece of me, an extra piece to the puzzle that makes up me as a person, buried somewhere inside of me, and I could never quite find it. And then when I gave birth to my son, it was kind of like he reached out deep inside me, found it and pulled it out and handed it to me. And there I saw this other piece of my identity. Not that I wasn't whole as a person before I had kids, and I think it's really important that we are happy and, you know, whole as ourselves before we have children, because we don't want to be projecting onto them that they're here to make us happy. That's something I'm really keen to avoid. But it's more like I've just had this extra piece added to me, and I'm like, here's a new side of my identity, a new part of me to explore. But fundamentally, I'm still the same person. It's just this new bit has been sort of added on, and there are new ways that I see the world and new things that I am particularly emotional about that I perhaps wasn't before. Oh my god, don't watch Dumbo when you have a baby. It is brutal as a mum to watch that. I don't know why I did that. I'm also finding that I am becoming a bit more political since I've had my son. I was always, maybe not always, but like definitely as I've got older, I've become more interested in politics in general, particularly as when I first started on YouTube, I remember I was always really careful not to do anything that was remotely political, not to say anything remotely political, to kind of remain very neutral, because I wanted my channel just to be focused on like menstrual health education and stuff. But politics, particularly in the UK, was very different at that time. You know, you had the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, etc. But in particular, the differences between Labour and the Conservatives, there were differences, but they at least were all kind of people you looked at, and you looked at as professionally. Like, with politicians, you're like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with your views, but I'm not going to be embarrassed to have you as the leader of my country, in the way that more recently we've had leaders of the Conservative Party who have just been, I've been like, I don't want to admit that I'm British with them as my Prime Minister. I'm like, I did not vote for these people, just to be very clear. And so now it feels like there are actually a lot bigger differences between our parties, and we have one party that has gone much more right-wing than it previously was. It was sort of, originally I think you could say the parties were more slightly centre-right and centre-left, but they weren't too different. I feel like the politicians that we had just over a decade ago now, even if you didn't necessarily agree with their policies and stuff, they still had morals and integrity in a way that some of the politicians we've seen recently really don't, and have just been a national embarrassment, quite frankly. And I think as that shift changed, I too have changed and become more political, because it's become increasingly more important that we do get political. And I think also growing up, we were kind of told, you know, there's a sort of subtle language that you're exposed to which said that being political was a bad thing, like, oh, don't bring politics into it. Even now, like, I might post something on my Instagram, people are like, you should leave politics out of it. I cannot state this enough, get political. It is not a bad thing to be involved in politics. It is literally what shapes your future as a country, and everyone who has the right to vote should vote. This is something I fundamentally believe in. Politics isn't just about the people you see on the television. Politics is about the people who make the decisions that affect you, that affect your housing costs, they affect the price of your food, where you can study, how you travel the world. Like, so every aspect of your life actually is defined by politics. So get political, get involved in it. It's not a bad thing. And I'm definitely planning to talk a bit more about this as we go forward, particularly because we've just had it announced in the UK that we're going to have a general election finally. And I am just done with this Tory government. I cannot wait for a Labour government to come in. And I think one of the things that people have been saying to me is they're like, oh, I don't know how to vote in this election or anything. And I would just say, look at how the country has been. If you're in the UK, look at how the country has been for the last 14 years. Look at your life right now, because that's not going to change if you vote for the current party in power. If you don't vote at all and you're young like me, if you're under 40, for example, then you are essentially giving a vote to the Conservatives. Because not voting for a young generation generally doesn't vote as much as the older generation, and the older generation generally vote more Conservative than they do for Labour. So if you don't vote, you give an extra vote to the Conservatives. So I am very much in favour of having a Labour majority government coming in as the next government, but actually where I live, the most likely candidates to win are either Tory, so Conservative, or Liberal Democrat. Labour is very far behind, so they're never going to win in my area. So I choose to tactically vote. And what that basically means is that I say, okay, Labour can't win here, but I really don't want to have a Conservative MP representing me, so I'm going to vote for the Liberal Democrats. And I have to say, we do currently have a Liberal Democrat MP around here, and they are pretty good. So I'm very happy to vote for them again in the next election. But you can have a look at online. There are sites that you can go on which will tell you who is most likely, the two most likely parties to win in your area, and you can decide which one you would rather vote for. It can be, I think, frustrating when you're looking at politics of the bigger picture, because particularly I think at the moment the Labour Party, I'm filming this right at the beginning of the election campaign, so who knows, in a couple of weeks when this probably goes out, things may have changed a bit. But right now I think some of Labour's policies are a little bit wishy-washy, and people are kind of like, well, I don't really know what change they're going to bring in. But there's an expression that I've heard, which somebody famous in politics will have said, who I can't remember. But essentially it's that the opposition, which is currently Labour, the leader of the opposition, throughout a general election campaign, they basically are trying to cross a slippery floor holding a Ming vase. And what they're trying to do is not do anything that's going to rock the boat so that they slip and drop the Ming vase. And that's kind of what Labour are doing now. They need to remain calm and together, and they do have policies which they've been sharing and things that I think are good. And if you look deeper into their manifesto, you will see there are quite a few things there which I do think are good and are policies that I am very much in favour of. Also, because the Conservatives have had such a chaotic time recently, the Labour Party is really having to show that they are the party of stability, and so they're basically just trying to keep that stable image throughout this campaign. So what's going to happen is the Tories are going to just throw things at Labour the whole time. Labour will do this, Labour will do that, don't risk it with Labour, etc. Whereas Labour are like, have you seen what's happened? The chaos? We're going to be the party of stability. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to show economic stability, stability in terms of not having constant changes of prime minister and ministers, etc. Just stability is probably, I think, their main aim at the moment. That can be quite frustrating, but I do think if Labour do get into power, that they will actually change a lot more things than they're potentially talking about right now for the better, because they are trying just not to rock the boat. They're trying to get that Ming vase from one end of the room to the other without letting it drop and crash on the floor and smatter into a million pieces. So obviously we have an election coming up here in the UK, but wherever you are in the world, if you have the right to vote, make sure that you use it. It's a good thing to get involved in trying to understand a bit more about politics, what politicians are saying, learning about what parties represent, etc. And at the end of the day, if for whatever reason you feel there is no party you can vote for. And in the UK, our election system is a bit different to, say, the US and some of the others around the world. But In the UK, you don't vote for the Prime Minister, you vote for your local MP, so your local Member of Parliament. My number one piece of advice, if you're coming into this election and you're not really sure who to vote for or what to do, would be to, first of all, consider voting tactically. So that basically means that you look up who are the two front runners most likely to potentially win an election in your local area. Decide which of them you would rather have as your MP and vote for them. However, if for whatever reason you decide, do you know what, I can't vote for either of these people, they both come from parties that I don't agree with right now, or, you know, I just don't like these people, I don't think they're going to represent me, and you're not interested in voting tactically, then consider voting for one of the other people that is running. Typically, there's a few people that run to become a Member of Parliament in one area. It's not just the main political parties. Typically, you might also have someone from the Green Party standing. You might also have somebody who's an independent who does not represent any party standing. So if you're particularly against any party political views, then maybe look at what that particular individual is looking to represent as their views and see if you align with them. And there are some other more obscure parties as well, but make sure to look into them before you vote, because you don't want to just turn up on the day and tick a box for someone. Now, I think it's highly unlikely, but if for whatever reason the area in which you are voting in, there's nobody standing that you are prepared to vote for, then you can consider doing something called spoiling your ballot. This is basically where you go to vote, but instead of ticking the box for one person, you can put a line through all of them, or just scribble over it, or you can put a line down it and write no suitable candidates on the bottom. If more than 50% of people spoil their ballot in a particular area, then new candidates have to be found, and basically the local election in that place has to happen again. I don't think that's ever happened in history, but essentially there is a process for that to work. But the reason why spoiling your ballot is important is because this still counts as voting. You have voted even if you have spoilt your ballot. So you have used your democratic right to vote. Whatever you do, do not just not vote. If you want to protest, spoil your ballot, but make sure you use your vote. I would, however, say do consider using that as an absolute last resort, though. It's highly unlikely that there is going to be nobody in your local area that you're prepared to vote for, even if you don't want to vote tactically. There is almost certainly someone who you will be prepared to put your across in the box next to. So do consider looking into your local candidates. But that is something to bear in mind if you really feel there is nobody standing in your area that you can vote for, that is still an option you can do, which still recognises that you've used your vote. But yeah, coming back to like motherhood identity and also how politics has played into this, I definitely have noticed I've become more politically interested since having my son. I was already getting more interested even before he was born and paying a bit more attention to politics, both local politics and nationwide politics too. But since having my son, it's become even more important to me, because whoever's in government, that's going to affect like how good the state schools are near us. It's going to affect how easy it's going to be to get doctor's appointments. If he gets sick, how likely is he to get an appointment there? You know, a lot of his future is going to be dependent on who is next in government. And so it's really important that I do take an interest in it and I do pay attention to it, because he can't vote yet. And so I have to vote based off what I think, who I think is going to be the best people to have in power for his future. So I'd be really interested to know if any of you out there have had children, if you've also noticed that you've become more interested in politics since having had them and becoming more aware of the fact that decisions that you make are going to affect their future too. Right, I need to get back to finishing my other work. But thank you so much for watching, guys. Let me know if there are any other topics you would like me to delve into a bit more in this new style of video and what you thought of it. And I will look forward to seeing you soon. Bye everyone, have a great day.